we've seen that you, together with other friends of this podcast, you wrote a piece on consortium news. Your group is called Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. You wrote this piece under the name of The French Road to Nuclear War. You're warning Joe Biden of escalations that can bring a nuclear war to this conflict. And could you elaborate on this article?
Yeah, I think it's rather important. We spent all weekend writing it. 22, I believe, signatories put their John Hancocks under it. What it says is that these reports that Macron, in his delusionary image of himself as Napoleon, perhaps, sort of little guy symptom, I say, that he says, well, we might put 2,000 troops in Ukraine to help the Ukrainians. Now, Scott Ritter is one of our members, and he took the lead in drafting what is really a very nice, concise memo, which says, okay, now if the French go ahead and do this, what's going to happen to them? Well, the Russians have already said they'll become primary targets, okay? Will they be able to sneak in there? No. Will the Russians know that they're coming in? Yes. Will the Russians destroy them? Yes. Almost certainly, yes. Now, I have to say almost certainly, because Putin has been so restrained and so cautious about these things that it's possible that even though the warning is there, primary targets, they'll let the primary targets mess around there. 2,000 troops is not going to make any difference at all. Okay, so what are the French hoping, or what are the people like the Polish people and the Baltics? What do they think they can achieve by this? Well, we're warning the president. Look, we think that once the French troops get attacked, and there's supposed to be some Baltic troops there too, they will say, hey, wait a second, we're part of NATO. So Article 5 should be invoked. Article 5 says if one country is attacked, all of them have to respond or should respond. So is that what the game is here? Are the Poles and the Baltics and the French trying to get their camel's nose under the tent here and say, well, we'll put NATO troops in Ukraine. We'll make sure that they get, well, we don't have to make sure. They will get decimated, we think, almost certainly. And then we'll say, well, wait a second, get to NATO, now NATO's in. Well, we're telling the president, look, Mr. President, don't fall for that. The best thing you could do would be to announce right off the bat that this is not a NATO operation, that NATO nuclear forces will certainly not be involved in any of this stuff, because as President Obama said way back 9 years ago, 2015, Russia enjoys escalatory dominance in this area. Fancy way of saying, look at the map, for God's sake. Look at the size of the respective countries. Look at the advantage in military production, artillery, and the rest of it. Okay, so if Russia has escalatory dominance here, and they obliterate the French, Mr. President, don't get mousetrapped into a war saying NATO has been attacked. The French troops are not part of NATO. Mr. President, the best thing you could do is make clear before they go in there that they're on their own, okay? And when John Kirby, the president's spokesman, talks from the White House, instead of saying, well, every country has the right to decide for themselves what they want to do, what he has to do has been very clear and say, this is not a NATO operation. If the French want to do something that doesn't make sense to us, well, they can do it, but they don't expect our support. Now, when I talk about mousetrapping presidents, I come from the heritage of President John F. Kennedy, who was mousetrapped on that ill-fated Bay of Pigs emigre invasion of Cuba back in 1961. Okay, that was just before I joined the agency. What happened was the CIA said, we're going to get Castro. We're going to get Castro. And what we're going to do is we train all these emigres, and they're going to take these little boats. They're going to land on the beach, and as soon as they land on the beach, the Cuban people are going to rise up and throw out this communist dictator. Okay? And Kennedy says, you tell me that this was approved by Eisenhower? And Allen Dulles and the other heads of the CIA says, yeah, I approved it. So you shouldn't have any qualms. So Kennedy very reluctantly approved this cockamamie plan. But what's the big but? He said, look, go ahead, try to do this. But if you run into trouble, if your forces get pinned down on the beach, do not expect any armed forces of America to become involved to rescue you. Got that? Got that? Say that after me. No U.S. military forces to bail you out. Oh, got it. Okay. So, as people predicted, they get pinned down on the beach. And Allen Dulles and all the Joint Chiefs of Staff were up in arms. Said, Mr. President, you got to come in now, for God's sake. And Kennedy said, you remember what I told you guys? No. The answer is no. And so they all got captured, hundreds of them. It was a fiasco, okay? Worse still, this business about the Cubans all rising and overthrowing Castro, that was made up out of whole cloth. Guess what? The operations port of the agency, of the CIA, running this operation, never checked with the people who were experts on Cuba, the analysts, the division where I worked. They never even told them about the operation, much less said, do you agree that the Cubans will rise up? And then, because they would have been told, well, no, Castro is very, very popular, almost as popular as Putin is now in Russia, okay? That's not going to happen. So they deceived the president on two counts, on that key thing about Castro being overthrown, and the other thing they knew damn well. Now, yeah, I'm not making this up. When Allen Dulles died, on his desk were coffee-stained notes in his own hand. And one of those notes said, when President Kennedy realizes that we need support from the armed forces of America, he will not be able to deny that support, because otherwise he will realize that the enterprise will fail, period, end quote. The enterprise, overthrow Castro. So what I'm saying here is that presidents can be manipulated, they can be deceived, they can be mousetrapped into things that they really don't want to do, okay? And we could see that can apply today, and it's very disquieting that this would be so operative today with Biden reluctant to start World War III, but equally reluctant to bear the consequences of losing the election, much less the war. So what would be his preference? Well, I don't know. These personalities play a big role in such decisions. And that sort of reminded me, as I thought through what's going on now, the parallels of the past. Well, I think, as I've said before, or quoted before, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that this is a rhyming sound I'm hearing in my ears about this calculation.
What's your take on the fate of the small Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, and these countries that survived the Cold War? And now they're getting involved in this escalation between the West and Russia. How do you find the future of these states?
Well, you know, Nima, it's really hard to be a psychiatrist and figure out what motivates the leaders of these countries. But there is a lowest common denominator, I would suggest, and that they're a bunch of political hacks that know nothing of history. Finland, for example, for God's sake, a prosperous nation living right next to Russia. They worked it out after the war when Finland first fought with the Nazis, right? Okay, were beaten back. They had a friendly relation. It's just not a peaceful relation, a friendly relation with Russia, and lots of mutual benefits for trade and everything else across the border. That's all gone now. Why? Have the Finns been persuaded that the Russians are going to take over Finland? Putin always says, "Почему? Почему? За что? За что? Why? Why? For what reason would we want to do that? I don't know. You know, maybe Stalin would have, maybe the old Soviet regime would have, but what's the indication that today's Russia wants to do that?" So it's either a complete lack of history and being political hacks, or it's not an either or. It's also there are military manufacturers in all these countries, especially in Sweden, that are making a pile of dough on building and selling arms. It's called the military industrial complex. I call it, if you have a pencil, you might take this down, Mickey Mat, okay? Sort of rhymes with Mickey Mouse. It's the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex, Mickey Mat. Everything is sort of funded by the government the government people are funded by the people profiteering on arms. One example would be, here's a good one, I think. In Germany, there was a big arms manufacturing concern called Maffei. And they were in league with a French partner, and they were going to build the common European battle tank. Formidable thing, right? Okay. And in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was the worst thing that could have happened to them because there was no enemy and they couldn't get anybody interested in building the common European battle tank until 2014, when the West staged that coup d'etat in Kiev, and Russia was all of a sudden a palpable, menacing enemy. Oh, Maffei, stock goes up. All the people's stock goes up, and they build these things that are not quite as resilient or adaptable to the kind of conflict that has been going on in Ukraine as the Russian opposite numbers. So it's as I see it, and who knows? It depends on which ruler is so disorganized or so bereft of any historical sense. But the military-industrial complex is always a major factor in Europe as well as in our country. You know, I think I have cited before one time where it became, well, where hypocrisy was given a really bad name, so to speak, when the Pope came to Congress, 2015, I think it was. And he said, you know, the real problem in the world is the blood-soaked arms trade. Now, giving hypocrisy a bad name, Congress people and senators get up and cheered wildly. Oh, yeah, Pope, you're right about that, Pope. And then they looked into their pockets to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed was there, and over here the one from Raytheon. It was really quite remarkable because these people get funded by these arms making and arms trading companies. And then they appropriate money to build more arms. And then some of that profit comes back to the companies, of course, and back into the pockets of the politicians. They get reelected and they appropriate more money. I mean, it's a really nice little circular thing, isn't it? That's what's happened in our country. And there are lots of people, not lots of people, 1% are sitting high, while the rest of our country not sitting very high. Almost record numbers of people in poverty these days, where there is actually no reason for it. And we faced with a choice of two possible candidates whose record shows they don't care much about people in poverty.
There is a speed bump on the front. There is a speed bump on the front.